Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the fifth session of the Spring 2022 SunoikisisDC Digital Approaches to Cultural Heritage semester. And this session is going to be on 3D modeling and reconstruction. This builds on sessions we've had in previous weeks on 3D imaging, for example, and other discussions around metadata and museum exhibits will also be relevant to this. So this builds on previous sessions. So if you haven't followed the previous sessions in this, if you look at the link below the YouTube video to the session page, you'll find links to the previous sessions in this semester if you want to contextualize this a little bit more. There'll also be more sessions later in the semester which will also be relevant, in particular one in about 3 weeks' time on virtual reality and gaming technologies in archaeology. So we're joined today by my colleagues Orly Lewis from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and Tosca Lynch from the University of Oxford, and of course Monica Berti, one of the co-organizers of Sunaikisis. We have apologies from Alicia Walsh of Recollection Heritage, who co-designed this session with us, but unfortunately can't be with us today for the presentation. We're streaming live on YouTube, so if you're watching this live, please do use the live chat feature to the right of the video to say hi, let us know you're watching and where in the world you are, and also to leave any comments and ask questions and join the discussion at the end of the session. And we'll try to respond to any of those comments that we see when we come to that. So I think First off, I'm handing off to Orly, who's going to give a general introduction to the concept and to the topic of today's seminar, and then we're going to have a couple of case studies of different kinds of 3D modeling, first from Tosca and then the second one from Orly, and then I'm going to give a brief tutorial around the suggested exercise that we proposed, which again, if you go to the session page, you'll see that at the bottom of the page, which involves using SketchUp Make to produce a reconstruction of an ancient building. But we'll come to that a bit later. But I'll start off, hand over to Orly.
Okay, thanks very much, Gabby. Hi, everyone. So just to make sure, so the introduction presentation is on the screen for everyone, right? This at the moment. Great. Yes. Okay. So what I'm just going to do briefly is to sort of give a general introduction to this session and the idea of modeling and 3D modeling from scratch, as opposed to an earlier session which dealt with 3D modeling from scanning, of sort of artifacts which are present and one can capture. And what we're going to be talking about today is creating these 3D models from scratch of artifacts which are no longer there to scan, or certain ideas, for instance, or no artifact which was actually even there in the first place. So one of the main issues I want to put on the table and that we'll be discussing today is sort of what makes a 3D model scholarship. Okay, why is it a scholarly output? Why is it a part of my research process? So we need to first think of the fact that when creating such a 3D model, such a 3D reconstruction, what we're actually doing is presenting and creating a visual representation of our sources. These sources might be textual, there might be material, there might be a combination of these, but we are interpreting. What we know, the data we have, but presenting this interpretation in a visual way, as opposed to a sort of textual, more traditional way, such as in a form of an article or a book. Now, this modeling process, the creation and production of such a model is first and foremost for us as scholars doing it, whether we are doing it ourselves or someone else is doing it for us, but in collaboration with us, and we'll be talking about these issues as well today. This is already a research process for us. It helps us understand things, it helps us to better see where we have gaps in what we know and in our sources, and in a way it's a much more reflective research process than when writing, and often what one can convey in one word and the ambiguity is there and it's fine in a certain word or a certain phrase we present, when we create a 3D model, this visualization, we cannot be, there are many times we need to make decisions which we don't need to make when we are writing. On the other hand, once we've created a 3D model, usually we would want to share it. Usually it can be useful, it can help other scholars, other researchers. And in this output of our interpretive process, of our research process, becomes something that others use. It's a research output which we share and disseminate with other scholars and other researchers. And this is where another important aspect we'll be talking about today comes in what we need to be providing for these scholars. So if we just present this 3D model on its own, as much as it was a good process for us, it's limited in its usability and scholarly usability for other scholars. What other scholars need is a lot of information accompanying this 3D model, a kind of commentary, all these kind of footnotes which we usually have in a article, for instance, need to be there. We need to give an explanation of the model, of the content, and this is where we can also put in various notes about our interpretation, perhaps cross-references and so forth. At the same time, we need to be very transparent about the interpretation, about the interpretive and production processes that we ourselves went through and we are very much aware of, but we do need to convey them to the users in order to keep it on a scholarly standard. We need to reflect our decisions, be transparent and provide information about them. I think you might have already encountered in the previous sessions the terms such as metadata, so the data explaining the output, explaining other data, or terms such as paradata, information and data that we give in order to explain the process of our creation of new data, for instance, this 3D model, which becomes a source for other scholars. So we want to provide this information about the decisions we were making, about the software we were using when modeling, and of course also provide all the references and sources about the different parts sometimes of a model. Perhaps we have one source for 5 lines and a circle in our 3D model, and a different source for another part of the model. And then the idea here is, again, the aim is to enable discussion, like with any scholarly output, discussion, criticism, other scholars being able to recreate what we've done, and of course, for us or others to improve and make this as a basis for further research. And all this, of course, we face various challenges, which we'll be discussing again as well today, both on 3 levels, one might say. On the practical level of how do we model, how do we create this 3D model, on the scholarly level of how do we create this reliable, useful model, meeting these standards, and how do we publish it? How do we publish it as scholarship and make it available with all this extra metadata, paradata, and information that we want to, we have to provide for other scholars. So let's kick off and move to Tosca. Thank you.
Great. Tosca? You're muted still.
Right, thank you. So, as many of you know already, my research field is ancient Greek music, or the arts of the muses, which is a relatively new research field that is expanding rapidly thanks to lots of new evidence and methods that we have gathered and developed over the last 50 years or so. But differently from what we might expect, the term musicae, the art of the muses, do not denote only music in the modern sense of the word, but embraced many different products of the arts of the muses, including dance, poetry, drama, as well as solo and choral singing and instrumental music. Over the last 10 years or so, I've developed a new research approach that combines technical and theoretical evidence concerning ancient harmonics, rhythmics, and notation with important cultural insights offered by literary and philosophical sources. So the interplay of these perspectives can offer new solutions to important questions, such as the nature of the classical modes, called harmoniae, and their cultural significance, which I will discuss in a book I'm currently preparing. I also have offered a reconstruction of the modulation system developed by professional performers in late classical times, the so-called new musicians, who greatly expanded the harmonic capabilities of the two main families of Greek instruments: double pipes, called alloy, which we will discuss today, and professional lyres, called kitharae. As I show in two forthcoming articles, the reconstruction I presented in 2018 is fully supported by the documentary evidence we have about ancient Greek music. More recently, I've expanded this approach to include archaeological finds, which is, as you know, an essential source of evidence that is interestingly convergent with the technical models I've just mentioned. So this is a context in which I have developed an interest in 3D modeling, and with a special focus on alloy. And today, as I said earlier, I will discuss a case of the Louvre aulos, which is a very famous instrument, a pair of wooden pipes, which is very, very famous, and therefore we have lots of reliable documentations, photos, and detailed measurements. These pipes were probably produced in Greco-Roman Egypt, and their design reflects a harmonic model which was firmly established in the 4th century BC. For instance, classical poets, including Euripides, also mentioned it, as well as technical sources, obviously. But and it's often called Libyan lotos, referring to a particular type of African wood that was employed to produce these instruments, as an alternative to ivory or bones. So the basic model is firmly established in the 4th century, but this design was employed throughout many centuries, and in this particular type of instrument was probably produced in late Hellenistic or imperial times. We cannot tell really because we don't have radiocarbon dating or independent evidence to this extent. So as you can see here, these pipes are remarkably preserved in their entirety, and therefore are a very good solid starting point for 3D modeling and further analysis. On the other hand, the nature of the object, which is, as you can see, a combination of different curved surfaces, variable diameters, and has lots of different holes at different angles, posed rather significant challenges from a technical point of view. So I have experimented with several softwares, and some of them couldn't handle this complexity, whereas others could but were very complex and were not suitable for my purposes. I also found some of the visual interfaces hard to navigate efficiently. So eventually I switched to a different setup, namely an iPad with a pencil and this app called Shaper 3D, which has a rather more intuitive approach to 3D design. In the interest of time, I will not go into the details of how to produce these particular shapes, but you can see, you can have a sense, hopefully from these snapshots, of how the visual approach works and the different ways to focus on different details and edit them. It's also possible to import various images within the app, so you can have your model and other data you might need to have at hand. And the model can also be visualized in section view, so you can reveal hidden parts and work on them rather easily. So, as I mentioned earlier, these pipes are very well preserved, but an essential part of the instrument is still missing, namely its reeds. Ancient Greek alloy employed double reeds, such as those used on modern oboes, and not single reeds, as clarinets, for instance. But no ancient reeds survive intact to this day. On the other hand, we have a variety of sources that offer us pretty good evidence, and so we're in a good position to reconstruct the essential features of ancient reeds. These sources include broken remains of a reed from Ptolemaic Egypt, and a sketch of a double reed that was still fitted in one of the pipes acquired by the Berlin Egyptian Museum in 1894. Sadly, it's not there any longer, but it's very important because it confirms the kind of general design and the fact that there were double reeds. And this particular sketch is very important for the case of the Louvre aulos, because it is very similar in design, not identical, but very similar in design to the Louvre pipes, as is shown in an article by Stefan Hagel. So this is very important evidence for us. A third source, very important also, is iconography, which clearly confirms that alloy had double reeds. On the other hand, it's not always the relationship between the size of the instrument and the length of the reeds is not immediately relevant for the Louvre aulos in all cases, because ancient Greek musicians had lots of different kinds of alloy that had different sizes and ranged from small high-pitched pipes to pretty large instruments suitable for men and professionals. So we need to evaluate what instruments and what context we're talking about when we're looking at different images. And these different types of alloy had very different registers and sizes, and therefore needed different reed lengths. They covered a pretty large range of pitches, about over 3 octaves, we are told by Aristophanes, so one of the most important authorities about ancient Greek music. This is an important clarification about the nature of these reeds. The fact that there were double reeds means that alloy were closed pipes and not flutes, which is a mistaken translation. It's still very frequent in literature as well as catalogues, etc., but it's fundamentally misleading and a pretty big obstacle to research for many people. The Greeks obviously had flutes too, were called plagialoi, but they had a completely different design, as you can see here. And this design was clearly reflected in iconography as well. Knowing that alloy were closed pipes makes it possible for us also to try and determine the scale they produced. So to this end, I've developed a simple mathematical model that calculates the basic pitches of the notes produced by different finger holes on the basis of variable reed lengths. Then the calculator automatically identifies these pitches with modern notes, adjusted by microtonal variations in cents if necessary. And this identification can also be adjusted to different chamber pitches, which allows us to evaluate not just the inner structure of the scale, but also its relationship to other instruments and tunings within the Greek harmonic system. I will show in a publication I'm currently preparing that the scale produced by Louvre aulos corresponds to well-established tunings described in theoretical sources. But at the same time, a word of caution is in order, methodologically speaking, because as any modern player will confirm, double reeds are extremely temperamental, and the pitches produced by a single pair of reeds can change significantly over time. Plato and Aristotle point out that the same was actually true for ancient aulos players too. So the fingerhole patterns were only a basic blueprint that aulos players adapted and altered to produce different tuning shades. So we need to take that as a starting point that obviously underwent significant alterations in actual musical practice. Then the fifth and final group of evidence is an extended passage by Theophrastus that describes the particular features and growth patterns of the type of reed cane that the Greeks used to produce ancient reeds. Theophrastus also very helpfully describes some key steps in the process of reed manufacture, which is very complex. This evidence has been really essential for practical experiments on working replicas of ancient instruments. These kind of experiments are obviously essential to confirm other estimates we mentioned, but they have their own problems in that they can be influenced by our own cultural biases, and we need to work very hard to avoid projecting unwarranted assumptions onto ancient Greek musical models. So it is essential to start and always verify what we're doing on the basis of literary, philosophical, and technical sources. Otherwise, it cannot be regarded as a kind of truly scholarly endeavor. On the other hand, ethnomusicological parallels with living musical cultures that are closer to what we know about the Greek model can also offer extremely helpful parallels and ideas and correctives. So here is the final model I produced on the basis of the combination of these sources, and you can see it from the top side by side with the original model. And here you can see a few different angles and views of the instrument. So as I mentioned earlier, the scale produced by this 3D model corresponds to known ancient modes, but also matches quite closely some iconographic representations. For example, the Peleus painter has produced lots of different detailed images of ancient instruments. Clearly, he had an interest in the details of alloy and different instruments. So you can see here, for instance, the case of an aulos player at a symposium with the model projected on top of it, and you can see it's pretty close. And the same thing happens in the case of another amphora by the Peleus painter. Now, I've also shared the final model on Sketchfab, and you can find it here. I think we'll share later on the links if you want to explore it further. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Tosca. That's really useful background and lots of emphasis on the research that goes into creating this model. It can be quite easy. I mean, despite what we've said and what Orly said, it can be quite easy to imagine that we have a sense already of what this is going to look like, and we just make something that looks like it. But the vast amount of research that goes into producing this, and the tiny details. But I'm sure there'll be questions and discussion about this later. But for a second case study, back to Orly.
Thank you. Okay, so you can see my the other PowerPoint, right?
Yep.
Okay, great. So what I want to do now is, as we mentioned, another case study, namely of modeling anatomical ideas from ancient Greece and Rome. And the focus in my presentation is really on the process from the text to the model. So there are two focal points. One is the process from the text to the model. I haven't been doing the modeling on my own, as I'll explain in a moment. So it's not so much of how I created the actual model, but really how we moved from a text to the model. And the other focal point is the presentation of these models and creating a 3D dedicated platform for viewing these models. So what I'll do is just give a brief introduction and some key points which are important for understanding the presentation on anatomy in ancient Greece and Rome, move to the 3D modeling process, and then talk about the actual research platform we've created. And what I'm presenting today is part of a project funded by the European Research Council, and which allowed me to build a team, which I'll talk about in a moment as well as part of the process, to work on ancient anatomy, on the research and ideas and terminology in Greco-Roman anatomy. And this is what has really allowed to make some crucial breakthroughs in how we approach this material and what we can do with it. So let's begin with anatome, so the Greek term for anatome, which meant in antiquity both the field of knowledge that we know today as anatomy, but also the actual practical method of gaining and building this field of knowledge. So dissections and vivisections, opening up the dead and the living body in order to learn about the internal structures and again, creating this field of knowledge. So a few important things to bear in mind when we talk about ancient anatomy, ancient anatome, as opposed to what we might think of nowadays. So first of all, probably the most crucial point to bear in mind is the fact that we need to talk about many anatomies in ancient Greece and Rome. So today, any anatomical book or class you would sit in, book you would open, atlas software you would look at, will show you the same anatomy. There's a standard anatomy that everyone agrees on wherever one studies anatomy, and even often there's one standard terminology using Latin terms, so anyone can understand exactly what is referred to. In antiquity, it's in the Greco-Roman period, this is a period where anatomy is being researched, being the field of knowledge, it's being always updated, it's being created. And we're working with many anatomies insofar that each author is presenting a particular anatomy based on his own research, and also creating for it often his own terminology, sometimes using terms which were used for other parts. For instance, we have terms which, for instance, the term cardia in Greek, which can refer to the heart, can also refer to a part of the stomach. So one term can mean different things, sometimes even in the same author or in different authors, different things. And on the other hand, we have particular parts which can be named differently. For instance, a particular vessel, or just even the vessels we know today as arteries, can be referred to by the Greek term arteriae, but can also be referred to as with the Greek term phlebes. So we have this these converse cases where one structure is called by many terms. So there's a lot to disentangle, and we really need to work this from bottom up, source by source. And indeed, most of our sources are textual sources. We do have, for instance, anatomical votives and various iconography, which depict sometimes anatomical, even internal anatomical ideas, but these are not part of the research I'm working on, and they also represent a different level, different aims and different level of understanding, sometimes because of these aims, sometimes because of the people creating these. So especially what we'll be seeing today is based on textual, the ancient Greek and Latin textual sources. And we have a large corpus of anatomical texts offering descriptions of anatomical ideas, of the anatomical research, how to actually go about a particular dissection and what one sees. And we need to remember that the research in antiquity was mostly performed on animals. There was a period of time when also humans were dissected and probably also vivisected, that is, looked at and operated on while they were living in order to learn about the anatomy. And it's not that no research was done on humans on an internal anatomy, but most of it was performed on animals, not only for the sake of comparative anatomy and learning about humans as opposed to animals, but also by physicians in order to learn about clinical anatomy and how to treat patients. A lot of their research was based on animals. And this is, of course, something I'll touch on about how we work with this when we need to move from the anatomical text to an anatomical visualization 2,500 years later. So moving into the modeling. So as I mentioned, I'm not doing the modeling on my own. I have a team which I'm very fortunate to have, not only as textual researchers and classicists, historians of medicine, but also anatomy experts, both from the veterinary field and from the human anatomy field, as well as the 3D modelers who are actually professional modelers who can work quickly. One of them is also an anatomical, specifically an anatomical illustrator and modeler who works also as an anatomical instructor. So it's again a different process, but this poses other challenges, and this is part of what I was mentioning in the introduction. So even if we're not modeling on our own, we have perhaps another level of we don't need to learn the software, but we do need to know how to have a conversation and how to convey our instructions. And I'll be looking at this in a moment too. So just to sort of understand how we're working. So we have this text, and we have, usually it's in Greek. Some of our anatomical texts have only been preserved in Arabic translations of the Greek. We are working on them as well, but just to focus for a moment, so we're creating, first we have the classicists sitting with the anatomical text, reading it and translating it into English. Now, this translation of a very technical text and with describing very minute details in internal anatomy really requires already at this stage of the translation an anatomical interpretation, which is being done not just by the classicists, but together with the anatomical experts in our field, in our team, sorry. And this is really what creates a very detailed and high level of interpretation when the Greek text, the original text, is leading, but we're trying to understand what is there to see. So again, the writers of these texts were opening up the body and seeing the internal anatomy. And in order to overcome this gap between us classicists and them, we really need to know what they could have been seeing, even if they're describing it in different ways. And this generates a very interesting discussion between us classicists and the anatomists and the modern anatomists. So we have this first sort of very already complex stage of translating and interpreting, and this collaborative interpretation. And based on this, we create modeling instructions. I'll show this a bit more in a moment, but we've developed, and this was also part of a very long process of understanding how do we convey instructions to the modeler in order for it to be clear, in order for them to understand what needs to be done, but also in order to maintain all this power data, the metadata, the confidence levels, and the different understanding of the different details that we as scholars want to maintain and to record, and also we want to then later convey to those using our models. So just to show for a moment our modeling, for instance, this is an example. I hope Gabi, I assume people can see the sort of red table, which, yeah. Great. So this is something which, again, it wasn't an obvious thing. It took us time to understand how best to do it, and it's still work in progress of creating, listing the part, and listing how we want to call it. This is related more to the software aspect of how it will be presented in the software, another complexity, which I'll mention the software in the second part of the presentation, but especially with explaining the different anatomical details, but also presenting them in detailed instructions to the modeler, but also conveying and listing here, recording various comments we have, issues we need to solve, and a level, what is the source and the certainty level, which I'll mention shortly as well. So, okay. So just popped out. Okay, so once we have these instructions, the modeler can, we work on this joint collaborative platform. The modeler can extract the instructions from there, start working, create a draft model, and then upload it so we can give feedback on it. And of course, this is an iterative process where the feedback and the modeling process already and writing the instructions already sends us often back to the text. The feedback as well, once we have the model and the visual, we suddenly notice all kinds of small bits which we didn't even, we just sort of glossed over, but suddenly we realized that they're missing, Greek prepositions and the difficulties they present of exactly whether something is above or next to, or if they just say next to the ear, using para, for instance, the Greek preposition, where exactly next to the ear, where does it mean? It's fine if you just need to write it in words next and translate it. What happens when you need to decide where exactly you're starting the new line of the new part? So this, again, just to sort of convey the process. And I want to give a couple of examples of some challenges that we encountered and how we made the sort of the decisions and our interpretive decisions where these, so two examples of how these came into play. So one is from a text from the so-called Hippocratic corpus, the text on the sacred disease from the 5th century BC. A text which is not an anatomical text per se, it's actually a pathological text discussing the disease called sacred, disease similar to epilepsy. And in the course of describing the causes and treatment of the disease, the author also describes the related anatomy. For the author, it's very important to show that the brain and the phlegm which gathers in there and changes in the temperature of the brain are the cause for the disease. And the fact that the air which is required for the functioning of the body gets stuck in places in the vascular system and cannot pass through properly. This is the cause of the various sort of symptoms, like our hands shaking and the froth coming out of the mouth. So for this, in order to explain this, the author needs to depict the anatomy, and he refers to the vascular system, the various vessels, the brain. I can let me show you just the model. Sorry. The model we currently have. This is most of the anatomy, more or less the anatomy which is important for the sacred disease for the author is actually depicted here. So as you can see, it's a kind of very partial anatomy in a way, because this is the anatomy relevant and for the author. And we don't need to now understand this model. I'll return to this presently. So just to look at the case of what the author calls the meninx leptae, the thin membrane in the brain. He tells us already at the beginning that the brain, this is the beginning of his anatomical description, the brain of humans is double and a thin membrane separates it in the middle. Now, so we came to model this thin membrane, and this is how we did it. Okay, this is again taken just sort of 2D images of the 3D model. And we can see here this sort of semilunar, so to speak, membrane between the two hemispheres of the brain. Now, the question is why, I mean, the author Orly says that there's a thin membrane separating in the middle of this twofold, this double brain. So how did we decide to actually present it in this way? Okay, we could have, there are many other ways which one might think to present a thin membrane going through the middle of the brain, separating its two parts. And this is where sort of our modern observation of the anatomy comes into play. And what we decided that the author is probably referring to is what is called the falx cerebri, this sort of thin membrane, which we can see here. If we are looking sort of, the head has been cut in the middle, and we are looking from the right side, and we can see really that it's thin. So we were basing our interpretation and our presentation of this thin membrane on reality, so to speak. Again, based on the assumption that this is what they were able to see. And we do know that he talks about opening the brain of animal, and it's fairly simple, and I'm using this carefully, but it's fairly obvious once one opens. If he does refer to this in these terms, we felt confident enough to depict it as we see it as well. Another case is actually the fact of the spleen. Okay, so we can see it here and isolated here on the other side. And this is how we decided to depict the spleen. This was not an obvious way. There are many spleens, and different animals have different shapes of the spleen. And there was quite a debate of how to depict it. And what we decided was, since the author refers to dissecting and opening up the body of goats and sheep, to use a sort of fairly similar form to what we see in goats and sheep, which you can see here in the black square. So this, again, a kind of a decision based on what we find in the text, but also bringing in what we ourselves know and can see. And this is opposed, for instance, to decisions we made regarding Galen, a much later anatomical author, where you can see we depicted a much longer spleen after a long discussion and looking at various texts and understanding how we should depict it in Galen. And I won't go in here to the explanations of how and why. But just to show that this is not an obvious way, okay, let's just depict the spleen in this one particular way, that there are decisions to be made of how to do it. So speaking of animals, sorry about the barking. Okay, so moving to how we have been presenting it, and this research platform which we've developed, dedicated and especially for presenting 3D models of anatomy, of ancient anatomy, with the view of this becoming a way to present other research and scholarly 3D models. So what we have, when we thought about this model and are still thinking and working out how to do this, the idea is thinking again of the requirements of scholars when they come to research and use such models. And perhaps maybe the most important thing was the understanding that scholars are coming from a text which they want to understand, and they need to be able to move smoothly between a text and the model. We need to give them all the information to do so. If they're using a text and want to see the model, or if they're in our atlas and looking at a certain model, they want to be able to go back to the text. It needs to be more than a viewing platform, because the whole problem, as we said, there's the terminologies, terms that one doesn't understand. We need to offer this information. We need to give interpretations, interpretive insights on ancient anatomy, reflect these insights to other scholars, offer explanations of the anatomy, of the lexical terminology. We need to be transparent about our decisions, as I was referring to here, and you can imagine that there were many more in the background, and about how we made these decisions, how we produce the models. Very important that it's an open access platform that anyone can get to and use unlimitedly. And this whole process of designing the software, designing the platform, is very much user-oriented, speaking to our prospective users, understanding what they need, getting feedback on sort of drafts of it, so earlier versions of the software. What we have now is a beta version, which we released in October, but this is very much a sort of proof of concept, because again, it's never been done before for this kind of research, and we're working now on defining and adding more content and defining the new needs and how to get to them, and what exactly, gaining feedback and planning the next version. What we have in our software is, as I said, an open access web-based software with 3D models of particular parts of the entire body, with search and browse possibilities, with comment and some already commentary tools, and we're working on more and more tools, as I said, for the next version. So if we do look a moment, if we begin, one can search, this is our homepage, one can search, and again, it's a better version and there's much more to do, but you already get some suggestions when you start searching. When you search, you can see what 3D models are there, what various text results, which maybe don't have a model but are relevant to your search term. You can filter and sort by authors, chronology, and so forth. You can learn about a particular term, understand what it is, see references, see a sort of more concordance kind of reference tool. And as I said, if you click here, you can get to the model which you already have open, where you can view it, turn it around, see it, see the three-dimensionality of the body, go deeper, learn about, or just, fade the parts, hide them, and do what you need to do in the 3D model. Learn about the different terms, already see the explanation. Once you hover, you can see the term in sort of transliteration and in English and so forth. So, and as I said, there's still a lot of planning happening, and we're trying to understand how to offer the various tools. And one thing that we very much need to bring in, and I won't go into it here because I'm out of time, but I did want to just mention, is the whole idea of the confidence and source level and indication, which you already could see in our table. In the table I showed you that we're keeping an eye on, and we will want to convey this to our users with various ways in which we want to do it. So although we don't have that feature yet, it's in our pipeline, and everything is being sort of documented in order that we can convey it even on models that we already have and have already presented. So thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you, Orly. That was really interesting. Again, lots of focus on the research that needs to go into these models and the decisions that go into it, as well as the technical information about how they're built and how you publish them. So I think there'll be a lot to discuss about that when we come to that in a few minutes. So we've seen here two examples of using 3D modeling, 3D reconstruction for very different kinds of things. And anyone who's been following Sunoikis for the past few years, rather than just this semester, will know that in previous years we've mostly talked about architecture. It's quite obvious in some ways to think about using 3D modeling to reconstruct architecture. So I'm really pleased and really interested that we've got these very, very different examples from this today. And I say that sort of by way of apology for going back now, because the example I'm going to use as a tutorial is going back to architecture, and that's explicitly because I'm using a tutorial that was created for us several years ago by our colleague Valeria Vitale, who works on 3D modeling of buildings in Pompeii. What we've suggested, if you go to the session page for this session, again the link is below the YouTube video. At the bottom of that page, we suggest an exercise, and for this exercise, we suggest you install the software SketchUp Make 2017, and I'll show you that in a moment, and explain why we're specifically asking you to install this 5-year-old version of the software rather than more recent versions. And the short answer is because it's free. We have a PDF with detailed instructions, a walkthrough of building this entire model, which I won't go through the entire thing. I'll go through the first couple of steps just to introduce you to the interface. And we've also got some suggestions for what you might do if you consider this walkthrough a taster and you then want to try and build something of your own. There's some more suggestions of things you could build in there. If you want to try and build something other than a building, absolutely knock yourself out. SketchUp may not be your best platform for that, but I think it would be really cool to see people try different things. So let me just quickly share my screen here. So this is something like what you will see when you open SketchUp Make for the first time. Bear in mind that this is a 5-year-old version of software which has since been updated. There are more recent versions of this for which you can get 30-day free trials, or for which there are online versions rather than downloadable desktop versions. But because this version is free and is guaranteed to remain free, we thought this was the safest and stablest thing to use for an exercise like this that is going to be used repeatedly. So when you open up and you get this welcome page, what we want you to do is to ignore all of these suggestions to upgrade or to get free versions or to get 25% off or any of this sort of thing. Ignore all of these things. Also ignore where they ask you for a license, because you don't need a license for the free version that we've got. All you want to do on this page is simply make sure that you're choosing a template which will work for you. So for the purposes of this, we're suggesting we use the simple template and in meters, because that's the dimensions that are used in the walkthrough. You could use a different sorts of dimensions if you prefer for another project, and then simply click Start using SketchUp, and that'll take you into the editor environment itself. And so what I want to do is I want to just very quickly show you a couple of the main features of this, how you go about drawing objects and manipulating objects, and then I'll do the first couple of steps of the walkthrough in the PDF, just so so we can see how we started. One thing I would note is that I've turned on a key catcher on my screen, so whenever I press a command key, it will appear in the bottom left corner of the screen down here. So for example, this simple view first appears with a picture of a person in there. I guess that's for scale, but we don't particularly want that. So I'm going to select all. You see Command A appeared in the bottom left corner there, and I'm just going to delete that person. Okay, so we're left with a blank screen because all I want is to draw directly from scratch. I don't want any other things that are already there. So I'm just going to show a couple of simple features just to show a little bit about how geometry works in this platform. So there's various buttons up here which do various things, and some of these will be explained in the walkthrough, and some of them we'll use, and some of them we won't. I'm going to choose this one, which is draw, and this is to draw a rectangle. There's other options as well. And I'm going to draw a rectangle simply starting at the center point of these three axes, and I'm just going to draw a random rectangle. Later I'll show you how to draw a rectangle of specific dimensions. So I've just by chance I've drawn a square of exactly 3.93 meters per side. But what I want to show is if we then go from the draw function to the select button up there, is that there are actually 5 different components of this model so far. Okay, there are the edges, and you see if I click on them, they become blue. And there's another edge here, and there's also, so there's the 4 edges, but there's also the surface, and you see the surface becomes dappled when I click on it. Make clear if I zoom in a little bit. And so those 5 things are all separately existing things. So if I select the surface and then I press the delete key, you'll see the surface is gone, but the edges are still there. So we now just have edges with no surface in between. I'm going to undo that deletion with Command Z because I want to show something else, which is that if you select one of those edges and delete that, the surface can no longer exist without all the edges around it. Okay, you cannot have a surface that doesn't have 4 edges or as many edges as needed for the polygon. There can't be a surface if there's a gap in it. So that gives us the surface. The same thing applies if I'm now selecting a tool called push pull, which will allow me to sort of extrude a shape upwards just by dragging it. So that's given me from a 2-dimensional shape to a 3-dimensional shape. And again, if I go to select, you see I can select individual surfaces or individual edges of this 3-dimensional shape. And if I just delete one of the surfaces, it's no longer a solid shape. It's now hollow, and you can see the other 5 surfaces, but there's no longer any solidity to it. Okay, so that's gone. I'll undo to put that back. One last thing I want to show just with this random shape is what happens if you move one of those 3 different kinds of object that we have here. So I'm selecting the move button up here. If I move an edge, I can move a corner, okay, which is an endpoint, an intersect of 3 edges, and that distorts the entire object by pulling that corner around. Okay, if I move an edge, it distorts the object in a different way just by moving that edge and all the surfaces and corners that are associated with it. And if I pick a surface, let me pick a surface that is still flat. If I pick a surface and move that, you probably can't see very much happening there. I move just one surface. You see, it just reshapes the object, but it keeps that entire surface intact. So if I move from a corner and then an edge and then another corner, I can distort this object horribly, and I'm using the middle button on my mouse to rotate the view. So you see, I've done all sorts of horrible things to this, and this is not rescuable anymore. Well, it might be if I was building an opera house or something, but I'm gonna get rid of all of this again. So I'm just going to Command A and delete this, and I'm going to go back to the standard view just so I can see the center of my screen again. And now I'm going to go through the tutorial a little bit. So the tutorial, you may have, if you get the PDF, you'll see looks something like this. And the tutorial will give you not only the basic instructions of what to draw, but it'll also give you the dimensions that you want to use for that object. So the first thing we want to draw is a rectangle that measures 13.2 meters by 7.5 meters. Okay, so I won't show you the PDF again. If you want to pause the video and grab the PDF yourself so you can see it while we're working, then feel free. So again, if I go back to the draw rectangle option and I go to the origin point of this and I start drawing a rectangle. Now you see the dimensions are down here in the bottom right hand corner of the screen. It's currently 2.5 by, it's now, so I could just go down and try and get it so that it's 13.2 by 7.5, but it'd be really fiddly. So instead I'm just going to draw a rectangle of any dimensions, and without clicking on anything, I'm going to release my mouse. Without clicking on anything or touching anything, I'm just going to start typing, and I'm going to type 13.2 7.5. Bear in mind that if you've installed this in a part of the world where the decimal point is represented by a comma rather than a full stop, then you'll want to type 13,2 semicolon 7,5. Okay, just to make that clearer. But so I've just typed 13.2 comma 7.5, and then I press enter, and it's given me those dimensions of my object, and I'm just using again the middle mouse button to reposition myself on the screen so I can see everything. And so there I've got a rectangle of the right dimensions. I'm just going to do the next few steps just quickly. So the next step in the instructions is the offset step. So having got a rectangle, I'm going to use the offset tool, and for this you click anywhere inside the object and start dragging, and it creates an offset from the edge of the object, and we want that offset to be 0.44 meters. So I start a type. I think I've accidentally clicked on something, so I'm going to have to undo that and do it again. You must do nothing in between releasing the mouse and typing your action. It's still not working. I seem to have. Okay, let me go back to offset tool 0.44. It's created an offset 44 centimeters in from the outside edge. Those are going to be the walls of our building. Okay, so the building has these dimensions. It has walls roughly 44 centimeters thick. So in order to turn those that edge around there into a wall, I'm going to use that extrude tool, the push-pull tool that I showed you earlier. And notice that if I hover over the middle, that gets highlighted. But if I hover over the edge, that part gets highlighted. I'm going to start raising just that outer edge, and I want to raise this to exactly 6 meters. So rather than dragging it and trying to guess that, I'm just going to release the mouse, press 6 and enter, and let me just zoom out. And there you've got 6 meter high walls solid around your object. Note that that it is going to be much easier to do this sort of work if you have an actual mouse as opposed to using a trackpad or a touch screen. Also, I think there's just so many things that it's really useful to have the 3 buttons for. and to be able to drag and move around and so forth. So the one last step I'm going to show is creating these guidelines and using those to build doors and through one of the walls. And so the guidelines use this tape measure tool up here on the top, and simply going from the left edge, start dragging in, and simply, again, release the mouse. Don't touch anything or click anything, but just type the number you want. I type 0.73 for the first one. And then for the second one, it's 2.35. And for the third one, it's 3.08. And for the fourth one, it's 4.7, and for the fifth one, it's 5.43. And the instructions then say do the same thing from the left, so 0.73, 2.35, etc. I'm not going to do that part. You get the idea. I'm not going to do the whole thing twice. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the guidelines from the bottom, which I want to use 3 meters for the first one and 3.6 meters for the second one. And if I had done all of them, I would have actually I will do just one of the ones from the other side. I'm going to do the last one, 5.43. So I've got the guidelines there for 3 of the 5 doors that are designed in the model. You can do the rest of them. So I'm just going to design a couple of the doors just to show you the general principle. And so I go back to the drawing rectangle tool here, and now when I point to the corner of that, so the edge of the wall where it intersects with that guideline that we've just drawn, it will snap to that point. So I can select that exact point and the opposite point very easily, and release it, and it gives me that exact range. And so I do that again for the other doors. I'll do that for 3 of them. And then I want to use the arc tool, which is this one here. And the arc tool, again, this it's a little bit fiddly. So pay careful attention to when I'm clicking and when I'm not clicking on my mouse. So I go to one of the endpoints. I want to create an arc that arcs upwards along there. Okay, so I go to one of the endpoints. I click and hold down the mouse button. I go across to the other endpoint and then release the mouse button. I go to the middle of the line, not touching any button at all, but when it highlights the midpoint, I then simply move upwards, and this hasn't worked. See, I told you this was fiddly. I'm going to start again. So go to the first point. I think, okay, I click and release. I go to the second point, click and release. Then I go to the midpoint and drag up. Yeah. Okay, so that's what I did wrong. Ignore what I said the first time. I'm going to do it again here. We go to the first endpoint, click once. I'm not holding the mouse button. I've just clicked once and released it. Then go to the other end, click once. I'm not holding it down. I've just released it. I go to the middle. I don't click at all. I just go to the middle and then up. And then I click a third time to create the top of the arc. And I'll try and do that a third time without messing it up. Yeah, that seemed to work. Okay, so we've almost got an arch there. Just what we've got, you see, if I go to the select tool, I've got 2 separate sections in that wall, and I only want one, so I want to get rid of that line in between. So if I select that blue line and delete it, then I'm left with a single section which represents the whole gap in that doorway. So I'll go in and I'll delete that horizontal line in all 3 cases. And then the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make the turn that drawn arch into a hole in the wall simply by using the push-pull tool and just pushing it through until it disappears. And I think that's disappeared. Yeah. And then the last thing, I could do the same for all the other doors, but if you, having done that just once, if you want to repeat exactly the same action with the same dimensions, so just pushing it through to the exact same thing, simply double click and it does that again. So it pushes it through just the thickness of the wall. And I've only been able to do 3 because I didn't draw the last 2 to save us time. But you would do it with all 5 of those. and then follow the rest of the tutorial through. The instructions should be fairly clear in there. A couple of things in this tutorial don't work as well now as they did when the tutorial was designed a few years ago. So, for example, to import a stock object from the SketchUp marketplace, I don't think that part works anymore because of later developments in the way that marketplace works and the software works. So that part you may have to skip. You can still import your own 3D object that you've done, perhaps something you created in photogrammetry a couple of weeks ago. And I think the other thing that that may not work the way it does in this is adding the geographic information from the final step on this. That's if I recall correctly, that's not something that works anymore at this point. But otherwise, you can work through the rest of this and you'll have a fairly good idea of most of the functions you need in order to create a 3D model of a building. And then if you think having done this exercise isn't quite enough, you can go off and find another building that you have dimensions and so forth for, and try to create a reconstruction of that, which might be even more fun. But I'll stop there unless there's anything that anyone else thinks would be useful for us to add to this to mention. No? Okay, great. Let's leave it at that then. Great. If anybody watching live has any questions or comments, please feel free to use live chat and do so. We'd love to hear from you, and we'll respond to any comments we see there. We've got our eye on the live chat window, so we can call that up. But in the meantime, does anyone else in the room have any questions or comments for each other?
If I can, I have a comment. So first of all, thank you for this wonderful session, because this is what, not only because this session was not about architecture, as Gabby said, it's true, we had different sessions before, but because I think there are really interesting things about ancient sources. So this is not just about 3D modeling, and I will explain why. Because as we read in the description of this session, the goal today was to show 3D models of objects that we can't simply image or scan. And the other idea was to start with the text and go to the model. And I'm really happy about that, because I have been working a lot in the field of fragmentary literature, in the sense of reconstructing textual fragments. And today, I think that we have really a wonderful example of how we can go on with producing fragments, in the sense that, as far as I see, both Orly and Tosca, so you start with textual sources, and you definitely have many fragments, especially for music and then also for medicine. And then, in this case, we don't simply reconstruct lost works about music and medicine, but also objects. So how ancient authors describe musical instruments, and then anatomy. Of course, today, as for architecture, we can try to reconstruct these models because we have maybe archaeological remains, as with the aulos, or because thanks to our modern knowledge of medicine, we can reconstruct these beautiful 3D models. But I think this is super fascinating, because definitely, so it's another concept of fragments, okay, starting from textual sources, which is something that we also use for architecture, definitely. But so this is just a comment to say thank you, and also because just this morning I had a meeting with an important project dealing with the fragmentary text, and we were discussing about material fragments. So today we have another interesting example. And then other things, sorry for my long comment, but I see, Orly, that for your project in Atlomy, if I look at a model, a 3D model, I see that in the URL, I can visualize the Greek form, for example, for flaps. So I don't know your project very well, but as far as I see, you have a collection of sources, but also of the language, the original language. And then you have ancient references and then the 3D model. But I see here wonderful linguistic outputs, for example, because if we can, for example, connect, I don't know, linguistic annotations with your, I suppose, database and your URLs, where you have there the lemma, I suppose, of Greek word forms, of the medical terminology, well, we can really enlarge our linguistic data for ancient Greek, in this case, about technical terms. So I hope you can follow me in this. So I found it, I just discovered this now, looking at the URL, for example, in this case for flaps. And I see the Greek word in the URL, which is something interesting because technically we can use your resource also for linguistic purposes. Because then, of course, through your resource, we get not only the Greek term, but then also further metadata like connections to ancient sources, bibliography, and then, of course, the 3D model. So sorry for this long comment, but really, it was really a nice session. So thank you.
Yeah, did anyone want to respond to any of that, or?
Yeah, thank you so much, Monica. Actually, that's I never thought actually of the URL, because there are a lot of debates are behind the scenes of how the URL is very much dependent on various issues and how one gets to that page. But I can say that when I envisioned the project and how I thought of it at first, so the anatomical lexicon was an important part of the project, but separate from the atlas. And what happened at a very early stage, that the lexical info became, in a way, the key. So, I mean, for anyone who does know a bit of the software architecture terminology, so our sort of unique identifier in the Elasticsearch database is the lemma. And we're having various issues now when we're thinking about it, and the lemma pages where we explain this lemma have become very important, although in a way this was conceived as the end point of our research, because to create this lemma page, so much research goes into it. And we're now kind of thinking of taking a step back and creating a lot of what we're calling model pages, where we explain model per model, but very much thinking of maybe we should also have a separate lexical database where one just looks lexically, but it's so important to bring these things together. And I loved the comment that, and not thinking of the URL, but there are a lot of issues with the modeling when in the modeling stage. For instance, just to talk maybe about the software. So our modelers were working, they work with different softwares in the pipeline of the actual model. One of the models you can see online is not fine-tuned because it hasn't gone through the whole processing, but the main modeling software was Maya. And then we discovered that Maya is very limited in naming, and our software architecture is so that the modelers give the name we want, and the software code knows how to then, when you as a user you are on something and you see the transliteration and the English translation. But in order for that to be the name in the modeling software needs to be very particular, and you can't do that in Maya. So we went back to Blender, and we use Maya for adding things, and there was so many. It really brings into how I was talking about the text for model, but there's so much between the text model and software, and that's, I think, in general, when we are thinking about digital humanities, it's very important that when we're creating these platforms, it's not just what the users need, but also, what technology allows and how do we deal with sort of bringing these things. And a lot of our discussions are not just the textual researchers and the modelers, but the textual researchers and the software developers and the modelers and the software developers. So, so thank you very much for raising that issue of connecting the lexical to the model. And of course, this is what we need as classicists. You want to know exactly what the term is in the Greek text, and what you will be able to in our next version is to see exactly the quote, exactly the reference, and so forth when you're clicking on it. So, because this is what one needs. And just to say that I've worked a lot on fragments, and I still do on on fragments of physicians whose works are lost. So I completely relate to how you're thinking of this as, it's just another. It's again just putting a puzzle together, but in a different way. So thank you very much for these comments. Wonderful.
Yeah. Yes, and then for the URL, of course, we have been discussing a lot about using URNs, URIs, URLs in the end. And I totally understand your difficulties in this, but I think that just getting the lemma is fundamental, because when we produce linguistic annotations, we annotate the inflected forms, or we lemmatize our corpora, then through the lemma, we can interrogate external resources, like, for example, your work. And through the lemma, we can get further, not just the Greek language, which is fundamental, but many other things like references, bibliographic resources, and then the models, the 3D models. But now I stop. So really thank you.
Yeah, that's very interesting that you said that, what originally was going to be a stark difference between the lexicon and the atlas became blurred very, very quickly. And you can't actually separate them from one another. And I think that sounds to me something that's going to be very important to the way we think about these sort of things. Yeah. I was interested in both projects about the way the 3D model is not only a research output, and it's not only a way of communicating your interpretations and your reconstruction of the object or of the ideas about anatomy and so forth, but it was a research tool in itself. It was a way of figuring out what was possible, how things could have worked. Taking the numbers you put in, you get things out of it that you can't get out of the actual object itself. In the case of the musical instruments, for example, such as the actual volume of air that would pass through it and things like this. And I was wondering, to what degree, in terms of the instruments, is the geometry responsible for the sound the object makes, as opposed to, presumably there's how it's played, and there's the breath that goes through it. The material, if you 3D printed it in plastic, would it make a different noise than the wooden original?
The material does have an impact, but the basic aspect is really the geometry and the structure, the design of the pipe, and that is one of the fundamental things. The other thing is what I kind of insisted, sort of highlighted very, very much, is that it's a closed pipe. That's essential, because if it is an open one, like a flute, then it works completely differently. The acoustics is entirely different. Yeah. So you get very different frequencies if the pipe is closed or open. Then that's basically also the point I was trying to make about how it is the basic scale. But then obviously the reeds are very sort of temperamental, as I said, and they get cranky often. So I was once assisting with a project where we were trying to record pieces played on one of these instruments, the replicas, obviously. And the Alice player is very good. And so we had sort of scores, and everything was apparently great when we arrived. But then the reed was completely off. It was like a tone off, and there was very little he could do. So in the end, we had to transpose everything and work from a different starting point. So there were those kind of variations also in antiquity. And then the other thing is, obviously, the technique was essential, especially for alloy. And so you could change, and they still can nowadays, embouchure, and also the temperature of the air has an impact, not as huge, but and then you can partly uncover one of the finger holes, and therefore you obviously can have nuances between different. So there's lots of scope for sort of interpretation there. On the other hand, there is also a limit, because sometimes you see, trying to experiment a bit too much, doing things that we know were not actually particularly liked, because you get very sort of harsh comments sometimes in literature about what people did and what people thought about it. So yeah, we do have lots of different pieces that we can use to kind of reconstruct the picture.
To what degree does is the software able to help with the sound itself? I mean, can you get software that can reconstruct sound based on the geometry? Or is that something you have to sort of get numbers out of it? And
I try to have a it's a very simple thing. So basically having the frequency, and then that is matched to modern notes, and then you can adjust that note on the basis of different chamber pitches. But then it is obviously very possible and easy in many ways to use then that to have a kind of oral sort of audible interpretation.
Right. Yeah, amazing. Thank you.
No, I think this is great. And again, you said interpreting too much, which is the problem, and which is our eternal problem, especially in these examples. So from text to model, and that's the thing. So reconstructing fragments, basically. So it's inevitable. We want to interpret, and we want to interpret too much. It becomes a problem. So this is I'm commenting this especially for our students who are following us, and they are learning these things. But I think this is fascinating at the same time, problematic, fascinating.
Very, very difficult. On the other hand, we can have, as in all the cases we have presented, we do have fairly solid grounds upon which we can say with, a good degree of certainty what we can, think was the case. So, but it is very important to be clear about, the limits of our knowledge, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's true of both projects and of the architectural example. That there are bits that we know, there are bits that we have a pretty good guess, and there are bits that we've put in just for completeness. But we've got to say we just don't know. I just don't know what this particular ancient author thought a spleen looks like. So I'm putting something there because we have to have something. And likewise, I've no idea what the roof of the ecclesiasterion of the Aegeum looked like, but I know roughly what ancient roofs look like, so I'm putting an example of an ancient roof there, because otherwise there would be no roof, and it's for the purpose of this model I need one. And what's important is to communicate the difference between I know exactly what he thought a hip bone looked like, but I don't know exactly what he thought a spleen looked like, and the various different degrees. And we've talked about the importance of recording the sources and the interpretations and the levels of certainty, but it's also making sure to communicate that as part of the research output. And that could be visually, that could be in metadata, that could just be in the written commentary. But when you're doing your exercise, for those of you watching, and you come up with your own idea of a building. You say, I've no idea what this part would look like. I've no idea whether or not there were windows in this wall because we only have the foundations. I'm going to put one here because there must have been something. Record somewhere and think about how you're going to record, which decisions you're making based on what sorts of grounds. And they can be anything from hard evidence in the archaeology here, all the way up to complete guess, but I had to do something. All of which are perfectly valid reasons to do something, right? But you just have to record it.
Maybe if I may just add briefly to that I think, because you mentioned, whether we convey this and present this visually or as a commentary, in a commentary form. And this is an issue that I've been thinking about quite a lot, and we are thinking now how to do this in practice. And I've done this before in sort of print version of anatomical reconstruction. But I think an important point to sort of motivate our decisions and to think about here is, of course, if we convey it visually, I mean, do we want that the person looking at the model will instantly know that there are problems somewhere, that there are sort of, footnotes or compared to triangular or square brackets in a textual edition? Or do we want them to have a kind of clean image and only for the sort of for the initiated, only for those who really want to go in and want to research it more. Should they then get the information? So sort of at what stage does one want to bring this in? And I think this is an important point to think about. I mean, in the context that I'm working in is, the different kind of users my atlas has. So, in a way, sometimes if we're thinking of modern physicians and practitioners who often go to ancient and historical anatomical ideas for various requirements and things that they're writing, and one wants to make sure, maybe for some people, one wants to make sort of immediately clear that there are issues here, that something is a bit off in a way. But on the other hand, for someone working with the text, we don't want to immediately convey it. So that I don't think there's one solution, and I think it depends very much on what we are doing, the kind of information, the kind of sources, and again, very much the users who always need to be thought of here, and the different kinds of users. But I think this is something very important to bear in mind. So not only where we are making these decisions, and to be very reflexive and conscious, which we are not always are when we usually work and not creating when we are not creating visualizations, but also to think to sort of think of when should I bring this information in and to whom. So just to add that kind of perspective to it.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. We talked a lot this semester about thinking about who your audience is for what you're communicating, and therefore what's data and what's metadata may depend on the audience a little bit. And the same is absolutely true. The example you give of comparing this to brackets in a editorial text is very, very pertinent. An ideal publication of an editorial text like that, especially in the digital realm where you're not constrained by the amount of space on the page, will have your critical edition with all the brackets showing you all the various interventions that have been made and interpretations have been made by the editor. You'll have a diplomatic edition which shows you the text before making any of those interventions. And then you might also have a reading edition where you don't have the brackets. You just say, this is what I think the text looked like. If all you're interested in reading the text and you don't want to know which bits are written by the ancient author and which bits are made by me, this is the text you want. But you also have an apparatus criticus, which goes into more detail about the intervention you've made. And you also have a written commentary, where you can sometimes talk about some of those issues, some of those problems, some of the restorations that you've made. You can discuss alternatives for them in there and all that sort of thing. So all of the same. I mean, I think that's it's getting a bit further away from the sort of archaeological and 3D stuff we're talking about. But I think all of those things have an analog in this sort of work. And how they're communicated is, the interesting thing to note is that there is no accepted vocabulary for how to communicate this sort of thing yet. We're all inventing it each time we do it. In fact, one of the readings for this session talks precisely about that.
And then definitely, of course, we can have different audiences, but the thing we want to communicate is that we always have a level of uncertainty. We can have different models, and this is valid for different audiences. So, of course, then we can decide how much information we want to share. But an important message is always to get a certain level of certainty, and we can do that because we have evidence, as we were saying before, for music, for example, but always keeping in mind that this is not definitive. We know that because we are working on these sources and reconstructions, but this is an important message, I think, in general for our audience. And I think that through these technologies we can do that because we can represent different interpretations. Of course, there is a lot of work behind for implementing that, but this is another fascinating aspect. So really, thank you.
Yes, thank you both very much. Well, it looks like we're about out of time, so thank you both very much again. And for people watching, I hope you have a go at the exercise, and please do join us again next week. Next week we will be talking about linked geodata, where in fact Paolo, who's the co-organizer of this semester, will be one of the speakers, and the other will be Valeria Vitale, whose exercise we used earlier today, wearing a different hat on this occasion. So please join us then. Thank you both very much.
Thank you
Thank you.
very much.
Thank you.